I'll start in 3, 2, 1. On strategy, I find it very interesting that the previous speaker spent the vast majority of their speech explaining to you why constitutions are incredibly good and adaptable, yet they never actually engage with Marcus's 5 reasons initially as to why constitutions are made in incredibly harmful manners, gave you empirical examples. That was incredibly damaging to their case. That's why they're losing already. A couple things in the speech. Firstly, extensive responses in the form of a clash on which side gets better quality legislation, and second, on the point about the principle, and then expanding to you on our 2 arguments, explaining to you why that clearly takes us to this debate. First of all, let's engage in the clashes. There was a clash on which side gets better quality legislation. They told us that laws are going to be made better on their side because judges have this legal experience. And they explain that extreme laws are likely going to exist on our side of the house. Let me explain to you why this is not true. First of all, they told us that judges have no incentive. They explained to us that judges have no incentive to cater to the masses, yet also explained that judges are extremely scrutinized during public rulings. This is necessarily a contradiction. Why? Because when they tell us that laws are going to be made such as that, you can extend the term limits and stuff like that, this is not true. There are 3 principles of parliamentary sovereignty or parliamentary that exist. These 3 principles are: first, you can make or unmake any law; second, you can't legally bind future legislature; and third, no court can question the validity of act in parliament. The second one is particularly damaging to the case because then when they tell me that you can just extend term limits or you can just make yourself super powerful, this doesn't work because a crucial principle of our system is that you cannot legally bind future legislature or future parliaments. That means you cannot make decisions that are going to be legally binding in the future, and you cannot harm them in the future. This is another reason why, if laws are made even without this direct intention, if they're contradictory to a policy that's made right now, the future one takes precedent. This argument doesn't work. But moving on, they tell us that this is going to harm minorities, and there's a slippery slope, and there's public scrutiny for judges. I would first point out this isn't really mechanistically proven, but let me explain to you why scrutiny is far more on our side of the house. First of all, the main form of insulation that these supreme judges have is that they serve life terms. Any controversial decision they make literally can't land them in hot water. But moreover, the inner meetings of the court are hidden from the public. The justices meet a few times in a week in total confidential terms. Even the justices' aides can't enter the room. And if they need to see a justice, they can only knock, and this is extremely hard for you to engage in these kinds of justices. This means that there's less public outcry because the public doesn't know what the Supreme Court is talking about, and when they do create a policy, there is little that public outcry when it happens, and there's little that public outcry can actually do because you aren't elected as a justice as they themselves say. There's very little democratic accountability. But second, comparatively, politicians depend entirely on their legitimacy. So if it is what proposition claim, and these politicians are just making super bad populist policy, that means not only will they be punished at the ballot box, but other parties may no longer support your policies and may no longer allow them to pass because you're just making bad policies for the country. Notably, when P2 tries to tell me that our case only works in functioning democracies, and in places that aren't functioning democracies which have backsliding, this doesn't work, I would say that they can try to give you examples like Hungary, which cracked down on minorities, but I would point out that many of the states that they want to talk about literally use judicial review, such as Hungary. So the extreme cases that they talk about are probably worst case symmetrical because court capture and coercion of the judiciary is extremely common. But even if it isn't that bad, Marcus explained to you the point on the politicization of the judiciary, which I will expand later in my speech. But third of all, crucially, how did we flip bad policies? This is because Marcus explained to you on the politicization of the judiciary. What did we explain to you under here? What we explained to you under here was essentially that because judges are appointed for lifetimes, often longer than governments themselves are formed, and they rely on their individual biases and ideologies to interpret the law, this means that the harms that happen at one point when Trump decides to appoint 5 out of 8 of the justices to be Republican extend far beyond Trump's lifetime and will occur for similar rulings to be made for years and years to come. Let me explain to you crucially why constitutions are bad, because I don't think they understood our point. First of all, Marcus explained to you a bunch of reasons why constitutions are made poorly, which they didn't respond to. We explained to you they're usually made in a historical context, which means that no matter how well-intentioned they may be, certain ideas seem like truths at the time, such as gun laws, which killed thousands of people to this day. But second of all, they're empirically written in post-conflict states. For example, the common law in Germany was made after the Nazis. This means that they often have, other examples also exist, which means that they're often things, they have a common enemy. For example, in certain states in Africa, which means they need common protection. For example, right to bear arms. But also we gave you examples in which the vague wording in which they want to talk about is directly weaponized later. We gave you examples of Sri Lanka, or examples like in Turkey, where they abuse the vague wording to make it onto their side. We explained to you that this is likely going to happen, specifically because when presidents and politicians appoint certain justices, they necessarily, because of the vague wording, are likely going to interpret it based on their own individual biases and ideologies, because even though there are various schools of thinking, none of these are necessarily correct, and even within them, there are various contradictions. This means there's an especially large incentive for politicians to exert state capture of supreme justices along partisan lines, as they can side rulings in their favor. We've seen this with Donald Trump appointing a third of the Supreme Court who are strongly conservative. This is an extreme harm that happens on the other side of the House. This affects people in major issues such as same-sex marriage, such as economic policy that was harmful. But moreover, when they try to tell us that that the Constitution is extremely adaptable and it changes according to new times, this is just empirically not true. There have been 20 amendments after more than 11,000 that have been proposed for the US Constitution, with the last amendment happening decades ago. Constitutions are extremely rigid for this reason, which means that even if they're correct and there is an incentive for judges to have good policy and adapt with the times, they lack the capacity to do so when constitutions are made incredibly harmfully, when there is things like time pressure and they're inherently made in these harmful ways. But finally, to our principle, they say that there is intense scrutiny and people have a say in terms of who is appointed. The public can choose which justices are appointed and these kinds of things. First of all, this is empirically not true. We've seen in states like the US, it is presidents, it is heads of state that choose who the Supreme Justices are. But even, let's take their best case. Let's say the public in Germany can choose who their justices are. I think this literally knives their own case, because they literally tell us their judges are going to be chosen as the most competent ones, the smartest ones, and all these kinds of things. If that's true, how can you trust the public to solely choose who the most competent judges are? Rather, why aren't they going to choose the ones that are the most popular? People are actively disincentivized from voting because their control is taken out of their hands. We explained to you principally this is a power that is abused against the public. For all these reasons, it's clear Team Denmark. Panel, we think upholding democracy in this debate specifically relies on the fact that we're going to prove to you as to why we get far better policies on our side of the house. But firstly, a couple of strategic notes. I want to note that they had quite a few contradictions in their case, because they pointed out to us as to why we can't claim that constitutions can both be rigid, but also at the same time why constitutions can't be old, and why they necessarily can't be vague at the same time. I want to note here, panel, that both sides concede that neither side can protect minorities as a whole. I'll explain to you specifically why this is far better, but just off the note of this, I want to say that most of their claims of the contradictions in our case aren't actually contradictions. The Constitution, in many instances, is inherently vague for reasons that we explained to you from first, that you wanted to have both sides to be pleased when writing the Constitution, but it at the same time, it can be incredibly rigid. It's incredibly difficult to make amendments. A lot of what they say just strategically doesn't make sense and fall out of this debate. Okay, Firstly, I want to engage with the clash on minorities, because we explained to you already that constitutions are incredibly old post-conflict documents that have vague language that can be wrongly interpreted because of the terms that exist in them. This is just structurally true. We gave you reasons to this because you want both sides to be pleased in the short term. That is when you are making the constitution. But even beyond this, we explained to you not only is it vague in many instances, but there's often in-groups and out-groups against minorities. That is, when constitutions are made in many instances, there's often a huge amount of more bias against minorities than at least there is a bias against minorities now. That is, if you have a huge amount of like stigmatization against minorities or against black people in America when you were first writing the constitution, we'd say that comparatively, there's probably a greater amount of stigmatization against minorities when you do write the constitution then than it is when you do write constitutions, or sorry, when you do propose laws in the status quo. We say we've at least progressed more in that sense. But also the people who are writing the constitutions in many instances are the people from the upper ruling majorities. We explained to you that, for example, in Sri Lanka, it was the upper class, like Sinhalese majority, that wrote laws where the upper class was enshrined, but specifically it undermined the Tamil minorities' rights. We explained to you as to how this led into a civil war. We explained to you even in more like outright situations which they haven't engaged with at all. For example, in Turkey, not only is it the case that they have the constitution that says there's a Turkish national identity that is undivisible and therefore it must be whole and complete with only Turkish people, which means that it's very difficult to get people to speak other languages. Not only is this the case, but it's that specifically the Constitutional Court is striking down activists who go against the Turkish majority and prioritize other smaller groups such as Kurdish groups. This is also the burden that they had to defend and take in this debate. Okay, but just beyond this, we explained to you that it's that notice how this idea that the majority is strongly against the minority, and this is like broadly the main point they have left in this debate, relies on an incredibly uncharitable assumption. Because panel, I would ask you to gut check this. In status quo, how much of like people or not just like maybe slightly less prefer minorities, but actively think they should have less rights than them. That is, I'm not asking you to say that, okay, maybe there are some like racist people that may think that certain policies such as taxes should be made more favorably to them, or things like immigration quotas or these sorts of things. We're saying specifically about laws about treating people equal, things like workplace laws, or things like, for example, anti-gender discrimination laws. These are the sorts of things that the burden that they have to defend and explain to you specifically why people in status quo and majority groups not only prioritize themselves over minority groups, but specifically why they're doing this to such the extent that they say that our laws are going to be different from those of the minority. The reason why this falls flat, and this is the same response they give to us when we explain to you in first that there's a counterbalance in terms of democratic accountability, because people are trying to hold each other accountable. For example, the extreme right-wing parties never getting to power. The reason why this response falls flat is because if it's the case that the state is incredibly undemocratic, or if you have people that are incredibly against minorities to the degree at which they're able and willing to strip them of their rights, I think it's like symmetric at the best case. Because if it is so like undemocratic, we think that simply these instances are the very same instances where you exert political capture, and where politicians such as Erdogan take control of the courts and push out any party that stands to fight for the minority. If these are the instances that Team Scotland wants to contend with, I don't think this is the instances where they do get any delta in this case. Okay, panel. Both sides in this debate concede that neither side can completely protect minorities. Why is the worst of our harms not as harmful as theirs? A. Justices are empirically appointed by heads of state and the ruling party. This was key characterization that they failed to contend with. So when they talk about things like political bias, look, in our world, there are more politicians in parliament representing the majority, but at the very least, there are certain MPs in parliament that are voted in by the minorities. There are certain MPs that can make coalitions, that can agree with other groups, and they can stand for you. Comparatively, when the ruling party and the ruling party alone appoints justices, it is only the Republican influence, or it is only Erdogan that can assert the rights of the majority over minority groups. This affects which judges are chosen, and it's incredibly damaging. This means that the verdicts are more biased against minorities in Proposition's world. But B, in our worst case, where there's democratic backsliding and crackdowns on minorities, that this harms everyone, because your ability to express dissent, have diversity of opinion, and freedoms are actively harmed. This is why the majority are also going to punish you at the ballot box, and this is a harm for a maximum of 4 years. On their side, when a bad party chooses the justices, it leads to harm to minorities for literal decades. Notice this is the exact case with Roe versus Wade. Now, more explicitly on our principle, and I don't think this should take very long, because we explained to you that people should have a say in how their laws are enacted, because we forego our rights when we opt into the state power principle. Notice the people who made the laws and the constitution in the first place are people that are long dead. Why should they have arbitrarily more say in this than the people of today? Because we agree that we can be put into jail if we go against these laws. We think it's fine if people have a greater degree to say in what these laws specifically are and how they do act. Because notice, panel, that when Roe versus Wade was overturned by Donald Trump appointing Supreme Justices, this is something that none of us in our lifetimes can change, because we'll be, or at least like the older people, because these people, these Supreme Justices, are appointed for life and they aren't going to change the rulings. This is incredibly damaging and incredibly hard to change. Panel, there's only been something like 11 amendments in the Constitution in its existence. We'd say out of like 11,000, we'd say it's incredibly hard, incredibly rigid, and something that's very difficult to change and protect minorities. For all these reasons, Team Denmark. 1. It's clear that Team Denmark has won this debate. Let me walk you through what happened and why we've won it. First, let me engage with the clash that Scotland themselves said was the most important, which is minorities. To prove minorities, first we'll show you why we were winning on judges, second on constitutions, and last of all, worst case weighing. First, why were we winning on judges? They only said 3 things here. First, they said that their responses to our point on judges, first they said that, but people can choose which judges are chosen. I think they themselves realized that this was a weak response and empirically untrue, because they dropped it in third. We explained to you why. Like, empirically it is true that heads of state and politicians are the ones who chooses the justices, and we gave you examples to back this up. But second, we strategically pointed out that even if we bought what they said was true, and the public chooses who the judges are, that just knifes their own point on the judges being the most competent, because why they can never guarantee that the public is going to choose the most competent and most experienced judges. What if the choosing of the judges becomes a popularity contest and they never proved a safety mechanism under this? Why were we winning then? Because we explained to you also that it is often lower courts with inexperienced lawyers that can strike down certain policies as unconstitutional. Why were we winning on the point on judges? We explained to you step by step on why, when it is that certain parties with a partisan bias come into power, and given they are likely going to choose certain justices to back them up. This means that even if both sides concede that constitutions are vague, they necessarily then have to depend on their own individual biases and ideologies to interpret the law. This because we both sides conceded that judges aren't inherently like good willing people. They just want to abide by the law as closely as possible. Given that there are many different interpretations that are used that are not necessarily one is more right than the other, people necessarily go down on their own biases, which is why we've seen things like there being significantly more rulings towards Republican policies in the US. For example, things like transgender athletes and things like that. It is inherent to their case that that these kinds of things happen. And at best, this draws significant uncertainty to the case. It relies on the fact that the majority of Supreme Court justices are, for example, liberal, and take a more progressive stance in interpreting constitutions. Note this is incredibly bad because given in the United States, for example, you need 5 out of the 9 justices to side with you. They need a majority to be passed. But second of all, why were we winning on constitutions? Both sides conceded that constitutions were vague, but they tried to create an imaginary contradiction when they say, but a constitution can be both vague and rigid. I just don't understand why these two are mutually exclusive. Surely something can be made a long time ago and made intentionally vague, like the incentives explained to you exist back then, because you don't want to harm a certain party in a post-conflict state, yet it's going to be rigid because you don't want to change it in the future, and this is empirically true because it's very hard to alter things like constitutions. These were never mutually exclusive. We won the point on constitutions because we explained to you that given both sides concede that they're necessarily vague, and given that we proved to you on the politicization of the judiciary, the necessary consequence is that you're going to get more policies towards the party that you want. We just explained to you in third the immense harms of this. We explained to you on weighing that even if certain minorities are cracked down on our side of the house because there's a majority legislature that is imposed, there are incentives for the majority to also punish this kind of legislature that happens on our side of the house, because if you're a majority and you see your friends being cracked down, that harms you as well. Your freedoms are harmed, your ability to express dissent is all harmed, which means our harm maximally extends for 4 years. On their side, whenever a bad party chooses their justices, which is guaranteed to happen, there are literal harms to minorities for 50 plus years. This was a harm they never contended with, which is why we clearly won this debate.